He was the brilliant surgeon who thought he was untouchable until his own life slipped from his hands, and the only person who could save him was the nurse he had always ignored. Hello, my friends. Before we begin this amazing story, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and how your day is going, all right? And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. The operating theatre of Beacon Medical Center was Dr. Ethan Cromwell's kingdom, a sterile, brilliantly lit sanctuary where he was not merely a surgeon, but an artist, a demigod in turquoise scrubs. Here, the chaotic, unpredictable variables of human life were tamed, brought to heel by the cold, beautiful logic of science and the unparalleled skill of his hands. Today was a complex aortic valve replacement, a delicate dance on the precipice of mortality that he'd performed hundreds of times. His team, a hand-picked ensemble of Boston's finest, moved with the synchronized grace of a veteran orchestra, each member anticipating his next move, his next clipped command. Microforceps, he'd murmur, his eyes never leaving the magnified view of the patient's heart, and they would appear in his palm instantly. The air hummed with the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft whisper of the heart-lung machine, a symphony of his own making. Dr. Evans, are you observing the leaflet coaptation? A millimeter more retraction is needed, Ethan commented, his tone less a suggestion and more an indictment of a lesser being's momentary lapse, imperfection. Yes, Doctor, Evans replied, his voice tight with deference. It was in this moment of absolute, unquestioned authority, as he prepared to place the final critical suture, that his world first betrayed him. It was not a dramatic tremor, not a violent shudder, but a subtle, intimate rebellion. A faint, high-frequency vibration that started in the tips of his fingers, a dissonant chord in his flawless symphony. To anyone else, it would have been imperceptible, lost in the microscopic movements of surgery. But to Ethan it was a cataclysm. The needle point, once an unwavering extension of his will, wavered for a nanosecond over the delicate heart tissue. A cold dread, alien and unwelcome, slithered up his spine. His vision blurred for a heartbeat, the vibrant red of the surgical field losing its sharp focus. He willed it away, commanded his body to obey with the same iron certainty he used on his residents. Steady, he thought, his jaw clenched so tightly it ached. But the body, unlike a subordinate, did not always comply. Across the table, Clara Hayes, his head nurse, saw it. She didn't see the tremor itself, but she saw its aftershocks, the almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw, the way his knuckles whitened on the forceps, and the single glistening bead of sweat that defied the operating room's frigid temperature to trace a path from his hairline down his temple. She had catalogued every one of his moods, his preferences, his tics, over 4 years of silent observation, a skill honed for professional survival. This was new. This was wrong. "Doctor," she said, her voice perfectly even, a calm, clinical inquiry that masked a sudden, sharp spike of alarm. "Your suture tension appears inconsistent. Shall I prepare a reinforcing stitch?" It was a masterful deflection, a professional courtesy that offered him an escape route, a way to correct his course without admitting fault. His pride, a raw and flailing thing, struck back instantly. "Mind your instruments, Nurse Hayes. My tension is, as always, perfect," he snapped, the words colder and sharper than his scalpel. He forced his hand into stillness through sheer force of will, completing the suture with a flourish of his old, unshakable confidence. Yet the effort left him hollow, a dizzying wave of exhaustion washing over him. The room felt suddenly too bright, the air too thin, as Dr. Evans began the routine process of closing the chest. Through cavity, Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him. The steady beep of the monitor seemed to warp and fade, pulling him down into a vortex of encroaching darkness. Before his knees could buckle, before the myth of Dr. Cromwell could shatter on the sterile floor, Clara was there. She hadn't moved from her spot, yet she was suddenly at his side, her small, firm hand gripping his elbow, a quiet, immovable anchor. "Dr. Cromwell, you're hypoglycemic. You're going to faint," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone, a diagnosis and a command in one. "I will escort you to your office. Dr. Evans is more than capable of handling the closure." Her touch was not personal, it was professional, a precise application of support. But for Ethan, who hadn't been touched with such unassuming care in years, it felt like a brand. He allowed himself to be led away, the walk down the corridor feeling like a mile-long parade of shame. He didn't see the look that passed between Dr. Genevieve Langdon, a rival, surgeon observing the procedure from the gallery, and a senior resident. He didn't see her whisper, "Everyone has a breaking point," her lips curling into a smile that was less about sympathy and more about opportunity. In the days that followed, Ethan tried to bury the incident under a mountain of work and sheer denial. He told himself it was a fluke, a consequence of too many hours on his feet and too little sleep. "I'm fine," he'd bark at anyone who dared to ask, the question itself an insult, but his body continued its quiet mutiny. He'd find himself breathless after a single flight of stairs. Words would vanish from his tongue mid-sentence during a consultation. One afternoon, while signing a stack of patient charts, his hand began to tremble so uncontrollably that his signature devolved into an illegible scrawl. He hid it, shoving the chart under a pile of papers, his heart hammering against his ribs with a frantic, terrified rhythm. He started avoiding the operating room, delegating complex procedures to Evans and Langdon, citing a sudden, uncharacteristic interest in administrative duties. It was Dr. Mark Albright, the hospital's gentle but unyielding head of oncology, and one of Ethan's oldest, if most distant colleagues, who finally cornered him. "Ethan, we're having lunch," Mark announced, appearing at his office door with a look that brooked no argument. "And then you're coming with me for a full blood panel. This isn't a request. The tests were a surrender, and the wait for the results was a unique form of hell for a man accustomed to immediate answers." He sat in Mark's office a week later, surrounded by muted earth tones and abstract art meant to soothe. But all he felt was a screaming, internal panic. "I wish there was an easier way to say this, Ethan," Mark began, his hands folded on the large oak desk that separated them, his voice laced with a heavy, profound sorrow. "The results from the bone marrow biopsy are conclusive. You have severe aplastic anemia. Your marrow has essentially stopped producing new blood cells, red cells, white cells, platelets. It's a factory that's shut down." Ethan stared at him, a bitter, disbelieving laugh escaping his lips. "That's ridiculous, Mark. Aplastic anemia is rare. It's an outlier. It's likely a lab error, a contaminated sample. It's impossible." He began to lecture, to diagnose himself, his voice gaining its old, arrogant cadence. "It's probably a transient viral suppression. We monitor for a few weeks, perhaps a course of immunosuppressants if the counts don't recover. It's a simple diagnostic tree." Mark slid a folder across the desk. "This isn't a diagnostic tree, Ethan. This is your reality." He opened it to reveal slides and charts, a language Ethan understood better than any other. He saw the terrifying emptiness of the bone marrow sample, the ghostly absence of hematopoietic stem cells. He saw the graphs. His blood counts a series of downward plunging lines, heading toward zero. The clinical detached surgeon in his mind looked at the data and reached an inescapable conclusion. The man, the terrified patient in the chair, refused to accept it. "There are treatments," Ethan insisted, his voice cracking. "ATG, cyclosporine." "They won't be enough," Mark said gently. "The disease is too aggressive, too advanced. Your only viable option, your only chance for a cure, is a bone marrow transplant. We need to find a donor. Immediately." His luxurious beacon, Hill apartment, once a symbol of his ascent, transformed overnight into a prison of glass and steel. He'd wander through its cavernous, minimalist rooms, the silence amplifying the frantic noise in his head. The city lights of Boston, once a glittering kingdom at his feet, now felt like a billion unblinking eyes watching his decline. The search for a donor became his singular, obsessive focus. It was a brutal education in powerlessness. He who could command the resources of $1 billion hospital could do nothing to conjure a compatible stranger from the ether. The calls from the National Registry Coordinator became a ritual of hope and despair. "I'm sorry, Dr. Cromwell, the match from Germany was not viable. Dr. Cromwell, the potential donor from Australia, has declined to proceed." Each rejection was a nail in his coffin. He called his only sibling, an estranged sister in California, the conversation stilted and painful. "A transplant? Oh, Ethan, that's terrible," she said, her sympathy feeling thin and distant over the phone. "I'll get tested, of course." A week later, another call. "It's not a match. I'm so sorry." He could hear the relief in her voice, and he hated her for it, hated her for being free of the obligation to save him. He grew visibly weaker, the sharp, angular lines of his face softening into a gaunt weariness. He started wearing his father's old watch, the one he hadn't touched in years. He'd watch the second hand sweep around the dial, each tick a metronome marking the depletion of his own time, a chilling echo of the helplessness he'd felt as a boy watching his father fade away in a sterile hospital room much like his own. The call that changed everything came on a grey, rain-lashed Thursday. He was staring out his window, watching the rain blur the world into an impressionist watercolor, when his phone rang. It was Mark Albright. "Ethan, we found one," Mark said, his voice imbued with a cautious, fragile optimism. "A perfect 10 for 10 human leukocyte antigen match. The odds are astronomical. It's the best possible chance for a successful transplant." For the first time in months, Ethan felt the ice around his heart crack. A raw, desperate hope surged through him, so potent it made him feel lightheaded. "Who is it? Where are they?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "When can we begin?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line, a hesitation that made Ethan's newfound hope curdle into suspicion. "That's a complex part, Ethan," Mark said slowly. "The match isn't in a national registry. It came from the localized search we ran of the hospital's employee database." Ethan's blood ran cold. "Who, Mark?" he demanded. Mark sighed. "It's Clara Hayes," he said. "Your head nurse." Ethan felt a wave of vertigo so intense he had to grip the back of a chair to steady himself. The universe, it seemed, was not just indifferent. It was a cruel and inventive sadist. His life was now in the hands of the one person who represented everything he had spent his career ignoring, the quiet, diligent, and utterly essential humanity that made his own brilliance possible. For 2 days, he became a ghost in his own hospital, a silent observer of Clara Hayes. He saw her as if through a new lens, the mundane details of her day suddenly imbued with profound significance. He watched her patiently explain a complex post-op procedure to an elderly patient's anxious daughter, her voice a low, soothing melody of reassurance. He saw her orchestrate the chaotic turnover of an operating room with the calm, decisive authority of a battlefield general. He even followed her to the cafeteria, watching from a distance as she ate her lunch alone, reading a well-worn paperback novel, a small, worn sunflower pin fastened to her scrubs. One evening, he saw her leaving the pediatric oncology ward. He ducked into an alcove, his heart pounding as she passed by. She was on her phone, and he caught a fragment of her conversation. "No, Lily, you can't skip your meds, little bug," she was saying, her voice transformed, infused with a warmth and love that startled him. "Yes, I know they taste gross. How about this? If you take them without a fight for a whole week, I'll get us tickets to that concert you wanted. Don't worry about the money, I'll handle it. I always do." And in that moment, he understood. He was not just going to ask a colleague for a medical procedure. He was going to ask a woman who was already carrying the weight of her own world on her shoulders to take on the burden of his. The thought filled him with a self-loathing so potent it almost choked him. He finally summoned her to his office at dusk, the city lights beginning to twinkle to life outside his window. She entered with the same quiet dignity as always, her posture perfect, her face a calm, professional mask. He gestured to a chair, and she sat, her hands resting in her lap, waiting. He had rehearsed this a dozen times, planning to lay out the situation with clinical detachment, to frame it as a mutually beneficial, if unconventional, medical arrangement. But looking at her now, seeing the faint lines of fatigue around her eyes and the resolute strength in her jaw, the carefully prepared words evaporated. He was left with nothing but the raw, ugly truth. "Clara," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "I am dying, and you are the only person on earth who can save me." He laid it all out. The diagnosis, the failed search, the impossible coincidence of her being a perfect match. He watched her face, searching for any flicker of emotion, but she remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her silence a vast, unnerving chasm. When he finished, she simply looked at him, her gaze clear and direct, and said, "I know. Dr. Albright spoke with me this morning." The admission stunned him. She had known all day. She had stood by his side during a morning consultation, handed him instruments, and gone about her duties, all while holding the knowledge of his life and death in her hands. The power imbalance between them had not just shifted, it had been completely and irrevocably inverted. "I need to be clear about something, Doctor," she said, her voice cutting through his shock. She leaned forward slightly, her gaze intensifying. "What you are asking for is not a simple blood donation. It is an arduous and painful procedure, followed by a recovery period. You are asking me to put my body through a significant medical event for a man who, until today, barely knew my name." Each word was a precisely aimed dart, puncturing his ego, stripping away his defenses. "You are asking me to do this while I am the sole provider for my family, while my younger sister is fighting her own medical battle. So before I give you my answer, you need to tell me, why should I?" It was the most terrifying question he had ever been asked. He had no answer. There was no logical reason, no transaction he could offer, no power he could leverage. All he had was his need. "I can't give you a reason," he admitted, the confession of physical agony. "I can only ask, as a man who is out of time and out of options. I am asking you, please, save my life." He had finally surrendered. The great Dr. Cromwell was gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading man. Clara held his gaze for a long moment, a silent eternity in which he felt his entire future being weighed and measured. Then she gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I will do it," she said. And the relief that flooded him was so overwhelming he felt his eyes burn with tears. But she raised a single commanding finger, her expression hardening into one of pure, unyielding steel. "But not for you. I will do it, because it is the right thing to do. And we will do this under my conditions. Not one of them is negotiable. First, absolute and total anonymity. No one, not Dr. Albright, not the transplant team, will ever know I am the donor. We will create a file for a fictional out-of-state donor. Second, there will be no compensation, not a cent. My choice will not be corrupted by your money. Third, and most importantly, from this point forward, you will relinquish all control of this process to me. I will dictate the schedule. I will manage the interface with the medical team. You will become the patient. Nothing more. You have spent your life being a god, Doctor. It is time you learned how to be a man. Are my terms understood?" He looked at her. This quiet, invisible woman who had just seized control of his entire existence and saw not an employee, but a force of nature. "Yes," he breathed, the single word both a complete capitulation and the beginning of his salvation. "The terms are understood." The weeks that followed Ethan's capitulation unfolded like a strange, clandestine play. Their lives became a series of carefully choreographed intersections, governed by the rigid rules Clara had established. Their stage was the sprawling campus of Beacon Medical Center, their script a litany of medical jargon and plausible deniability. They met in sterile, anonymous consultation rooms, the air thick with the unsaid truths that bound them together. To any observer, they were simply Dr. Cromwell, the department head, delegating a complex case study to his most trusted nurse. In reality, he was the case study, and she was his lifeline. Regarding the hypothetical patient with refractory aplastic anemia, Clara would begin, her voice crisp and professional as she opened a medical chart, his medical chart with a false name printed on the tab. Dr. Albright recommends initiating the conditioning regimen next Thursday. That will involve 5 days of intensive chemotherapy and immunosuppressants to completely eradicate the existing bone marrow. She would explain the brutal process of stripping his body of its defenses, her tone as even as if she were describing how to dress a simple wound. Ethan, a man who had dictated such treatments to others 1,000 times, now listened, his hands clenched under the table, feeling the phantom burn of the chemicals in his veins. His instinct, his entire professional training, screamed at him to intervene, to question, to take control. "I've reviewed the latest European studies on conditioning protocols," he interjected during one such meeting, unable to restrain himself. "The data suggests that adding fludarabine could increase the chances of successful engraftment by at least 10%. We should present this to Mark." Clara slowly lifted her gaze from the chart, her eyes calm but unyielding. "Dr. Cromwell," she said, her use of his title a deliberate reminder of the new barrier between them. "You are no longer the consulting physician on this case. You are the patient. Your expertise is acknowledged, but your role is to follow the treatment plan established by your designated medical team. My role is to facilitate that. Arguing with me about the protocol is not productive." A hot flush of anger and humiliation rose in his cheeks. He was being managed, handled by his own nurse. "This is my life we're discussing," he retorted, his voice a low growl. "I have a right to an opinion." "You have a right to be kept informed," she corrected him gently but firmly. "And you have a right to accept or refuse treatment. You do not have the right to dictate it. This is the control you agreed to relinquish. Are you having second thoughts?" The question hung in the air, a quiet ultimatum. He looked at her, at the unshakable certainty in her eyes, and felt his anger recede, replaced by a grudging, infuriating respect. He was a terrible patient, and she was an extraordinary nurse. "No," he conceded, the word tasting like defeat. "I'm not having second thoughts." Their secret forced them into a strange and potent intimacy. Ethan began to see the hospital, his lifelong domain, through her eyes. He noticed the subtle hierarchies, the casual slights the nursing staff endured from arrogant doctors like himself, the immense emotional labor they performed that was never recorded on a patient's chart. He saw Clara moving through this world with a quiet grace that was not submissiveness, but a deep, centered strength. One afternoon, he arrived early for one of their consultations in a disused corner of the hospital library. He found her sitting at a table, her laptop open, but she was distracted, her face softened by a look of profound tenderness. She was on a video call. Ethan ducked behind a towering shelf of medical journals, feeling like a spy but unable to pull himself away. On the screen, a young girl with a bright, mischievous grin and a colorful headscarf was holding up a drawing. "See, Clara? It's a whole field of them, 1,000,000 sunflowers," the girl chirped, her voice thin but full of life. "It's beautiful, Lilybug," Clara said, her own smile radiant. "It's the most beautiful field of sunflowers I've ever seen. Did you take your meds?" "Today," Lily's face scrunched up. "They're so gross." "I know," Clara soothed. "But they're your superpower juice. They make you strong enough to fight the bad guys. Remember our deal." Ethan watched, unseen, as Clara navigated the conversation with the skill of a seasoned diplomat. Her love for her sister, a tangible presence that seemed to warm the sterile air of the library. He looked at the worn sunflower pin on her uniform and finally understood its significance. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a promise, a prayer, a symbol of a battle she was fighting every single day, long before his had ever begun. The dynamic shifted further when Clara had to visit his apartment. A crucial consent form had been delivered to the hospital by mistake, and protocol dictated it be hand-delivered and the signature witnessed. She arrived at his door on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in simple jeans and a sweater, looking younger and more vulnerable without her uniform as armor. She stepped inside, her eyes taking in the vast, impersonal space with a quiet, analytical gaze. The apartment was a monument to wealth and success, but it was as cold and sterile as an operating room. There were no photos on the marble mantelpiece, no clutter of books on the coffee table, no sign of a life lived, only a life curated. "It's very clean," she remarked, her voice neutral. "It's a place to sleep," he replied, the defensive edge in his tone surprising even himself. He felt a sudden, acute shame about the emptiness of his life, an emptiness he had never truly noticed until she was standing in the middle of it. As he signed the form at his large, imposing desk, she wandered over to the window, looking out at the Boston Common. "My sister loves it there," she said softly. "The swan boats. She says it feels like a fairy tale." He watched her, a woman who found magic in a crowded city park, standing in his pristine cage, and for the first time, he felt a desperate urge to fill the silence. Not with orders or medical facts, but with something true. "My father died when I was a boy," he heard himself say, the words emerging, unbidden from a place he kept locked away. "This was his apartment. I kept it, just as he liked it." Clara turned from the window, her gaze soft with an understanding that asked for nothing more. She didn't offer platitudes or pity. She simply nodded. "Thank you for telling me," she said, and in that moment the chasm between doctor and nurse, between rich and poor, between the dying and the living seemed to shrink just for a moment. The day before the transplant, the tension was a palpable, living thing. Ethan was confined to a positive pressure isolation room in the transplant ward, his body scoured clean by chemotherapy, leaving him raw, weak, and utterly defenseless. He was a king without a kingdom, an army without a single soldier, waiting for an invasion that would either save him or kill him. Clara appeared at his door in the late afternoon, gowned and masked, a silent figure in the twilight filtering through the hermetically sealed window. She was there for his final pre-transplant check, but they both knew it was more than that. He was agitated, his skin pale and clammy, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer conceal behind a veneer of stoicism. "It's the silence," he rasped, his voice raw from the chemicals. "The silence in here. It's so loud. I keep thinking about my father. He died in a room just like this. The silence was the last thing he heard." He finally looked at her, his gaze stripped of all its former arrogance, leaving only a profound and terrifying vulnerability. "I'm not afraid of dying, Clara," he confessed, the words a torrent now. "I'm afraid of disappearing, of my life adding up to nothing more than a list of publications and a large bank account. I'm afraid of dying alone, in the quiet." Clara pulled a stool to his bedside, the rustle of her protective gown the only sound in the room. She listened, her presence a steady, calming weight against his spiraling fear. When he fell silent, exhausted by his own confession, she did not retreat. She leaned in. "You won't die alone," she said, her voice quiet but imbued with an absolute certainty that cut through his panic. "Because a part of me will be with you. That's what this is, a promise. And you won't disappear because you will live." You have to. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes. Why? He whispered. Why? Are you so sure? A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. Because my sister Lily is on a waiting list for a new clinical trial. It's her best and only hope. It's also incredibly expensive, and my insurance won't cover it. I've been working extra shifts for a year, saving every penny, but it's not enough, she admitted, her own vulnerability laid bare. So you see, Doctor, I can't afford for you to die. I need you to get better. I need you to get back to being the insufferable, brilliant, and obscenely well-paid surgeon you are, because I'm going to ask you for a very, very large donation to the Pediatric Oncology Research Fund, the fund that supports Lily's trial. He stared at her, speechless. It was not blackmail. It was a lifeline, a purpose. She had given him a reason to fight that was bigger than himself. She had given him a glimpse of a life that could matter. A small, choked laugh escaped his lips. Nurse Hayes, he breathed, a genuine smile reaching his eyes for the first time in months. Is that an order? It is, she confirmed, her own eyes shining. Now get some rest. We have a big day tomorrow. The transplant itself was an anticlimax of quiet procedure and separate rooms. He lay in his sterile bubble, receiving the bag of stem cells, a ruby-red elixir of life, feeling nothing but the cold drip of the IV. In another ward, Clara underwent the apheresis, a machine quietly cycling her blood, harvesting the precious cells, the only discomfort, a dull ache in her bones, and a profound sense of exhaustion. She had saved his life, and they hadn't even been in the same room. The days that followed were a blur of waiting for the cells to engraft, waiting for his blood counts to rise, waiting for a sign that the gift had been accepted. Clara, on a mandated medical leave, recovered at home, fielding worried calls from Lily. Ethan remained in isolation, slowly, painstakingly beginning to heal. Meanwhile, Dr. Genevieve Langdon's ambition had found fertile ground in the hospital's gossip mill. She had noted Ethan's abrupt and prolonged absence, citing only a personal health matter. Then she noted that his ever-present head nurse, Clara Hayes, had taken a sudden medical leave of her own. On the exact same day, Ethan had been admitted to the oncology ward. It was a coincidence, but Genevieve did not believe in coincidences. She believed in opportunities. She began to ask quiet, probing questions, planting seeds of insinuation with surgical precision. It's so strange, isn't it? She mused to a resident in the doctor's lounge. Dr. Cromwell disappears, and his head nurse, who he can't function without, vanishes at the same time. I do hope she's all right. She used her position on 2 different oversight committees to access scheduling logs and leave requests, piecing together a timeline that was becoming increasingly suspicious. The final piece fell into place when she saw a junior nurse from the transplant unit struggling with a stack of files. A single chart slipped to the floor. Genevieve picked it up. It was the falsified chart for the out-of-state donor, but a clerical error had been made. Stapled to the back of a lab request, almost completely obscured, was a copy of an initial consent form. On the signature line, in clear, unmistakable script, was the name Clara Hayes. Genevieve's smile was sharp and triumphant. She had found her weapon. 2 days later, as Ethan's white blood cell count finally began its slow, hopeful climb and Clara was preparing to return to work, the emails arrived simultaneously in their inboxes. The subject line was cold and clinical. Notice of formal inquiry and immediate suspension. It was from the head of the Beacon Medical Center Ethics Committee. Dear Dr. Cromwell, Ms. Hayes, the body read, an investigation has been launched into allegations of a serious breach of ethical conduct, specifically regarding potential coercion and an illicit agreement between a superior and a subordinate. Effective immediately, your hospital privileges are suspended. You are not to enter hospital grounds or contact any staff members until a formal hearing has been concluded. The gift of life had been given, and now the bill had come due. The email landed in Ethan's sterile isolation room with the force of a physical blow. He read the words, "formal inquiry, serious breach of ethical conduct, immediate suspension," and a white-hot rage, the likes of which he hadn't felt in months, burned through the chemically induced fatigue. It was a fury born not of wounded pride, but of a fierce protective instinct. They were not just attacking him, they were attacking Clara. They were taking her act of selfless, life-giving generosity and twisting it into something sordid and transactional. He, in his desperation, had exposed her to this, had made her vulnerable. The fragile new life taking root in his very bones felt suddenly precarious, threatened not by a biological failure, but by the far more insidious poison of human ambition. He slammed his fist onto the rolling table, scattering the neat piles of his own medical charts. The sound echoed in the silent, sealed room. His first overwhelming impulse was to fight, to unleash the full, terrifying arsenal of his wealth and influence, to hire a battalion of lawyers and obliterate Genevieve Langdon and the craven ethics committee that had become her weapon. He was Dr. Ethan Cromwell, and he would not be brought down by a bureaucratic witch hunt. He was still a king, even if his kingdom was temporarily confined to a single, sterile room. For Clara, the email arrived not as a fiery explosion, but as a silent, creeping frost. She was in her small, sunlit kitchen, watching Lily meticulously color in a drawing of a sunflower when her phone chimed. She read the message, and all the warmth in the room seemed to leach away. It was a quiet, suffocating dread, the realization of her deepest fears, her career, the one she had built with painstaking care and quiet competence. The very foundation of her and Lily's precarious stability was threatening to crumble into dust. This was the price of her compassion. She looked at Lily, who was chattering happily about her day, completely oblivious, and a cold wave of panic washed over her. She had been so careful, had set so many rules to protect herself, but she had underestimated the viciousness of a system where reputation was currency and suspicion was a death sentence. The narrative was already being written for her. She was the meek, desperate nurse, easily manipulated by her powerful, wealthy boss. She was a victim. The label made her feel physically ill, for it was a more profound violation than any physical procedure. It stripped her of her agency, of the one thing she had fought so hard to claim. Her first instinct was not to fight, but to contain, to manage the fallout, to retreat into the quiet competence that had always been her shield, and try to weather the storm she knew was coming. The hospital grapevine, always ruthlessly efficient, exploded. Genevieve Langdon's carefully planted seeds of insinuation now bloomed into a full-blown scandal. The story that circulated was a toxic, compelling fiction, perfectly tailored to confirm the worst assumptions about power and privilege. Dr. Cromwell, the arrogant genius facing a terminal diagnosis, had leveraged his position to coerce his financially struggling nurse into providing a life-saving donation. It was a story of exploitation, a modern-day fable of a lord and his vassal. Colleagues who had once greeted Clara with warm smiles now offered her looks of pity that felt like acid, or worse, averted their gazes entirely. Her phone buzzed with messages from co-workers, a mixture of feigned concern and thinly veiled, prurient curiosity. Ethan, now discharged but confined to his apartment, a gilded cage where he was supposed to be recovering, found himself similarly isolated. The calls he made to board members and hospital administrators, calls that had once been answered with immediate deference, were now met with polite but firm stone walls. They were both radioactive, cast out from the world that had defined them. Their first phone call after the suspension was a clash of two fundamentally different survival instincts. "I've contacted a legal team, the best in Boston," Ethan said, his voice a low growl of contained fury. "We're going to file for defamation against Langdon and a grievance against the hospital. We will bury them in litigation. No, Ethan. Clara's voice was strained, exhausted. You can't. That's like throwing gasoline on a fire. You'll only make it look like you're a bully trying to intimidate your way out of trouble. It will just confirm their story. Their story? It's a complete fabrication, Clara. We have to fight back, he insisted, pacing his vast living room like a caged tiger. This isn't a courtroom. It's a court of opinion, she countered, her voice trembling slightly. Fighting back with your power and money is exactly what they expect you to do. It will destroy what's left of my reputation and prove their point. The only way through this is to follow the process, to be quiet and to trust the truth. Trust the truth, he scoffed, the sound bitter. The truth is the first casualty in a war like this. In the suffocating silence of the following days, Ethan felt his rage curdle into a grim resolve. He realized Clara was right about one thing. His power was now a liability. Any aggressive move he made would only be seen as further proof of his guilt, further evidence of his coercion. He had dragged her into this abyss, and the only way to get her out, he concluded, was to sever the rope that tied them together. If he was the predator, he would remove himself from the ecosystem. It was his last, desperate attempt to seize control. He spent an entire night drafting and redrafting a letter of resignation to the hospital board. It was a masterpiece of self-incrimination. In it, he confessed to leveraging his position, to pressuring Clara, to creating a situation where she felt she had no other choice. He painted himself as the sole villain of the piece, a man whose fear of death had led him to a catastrophic ethical lapse. He absolved her of all complicity, framing her as the very victim Genevieve claimed she was. It would mean the end of his career, a permanent stain on his name, but it would, he believed, exonerate her completely. He attached the signed letter to an email, his finger hovering over the send button, when the doorbell to his apartment rang. A sharp, insistent peal that startled him. He opened it to find Clara standing on his doorstep, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "Don't you dare send that email," she said, her voice low and trembling with fury as she walked past him into the apartment. "I knew it. I knew this is what you would do. Your one move, your only move, is to take control even if it means blowing everything up." Ethan was stunned. "I'm trying to protect you, Clara, to save your career." "I don't want to be protected," she shot back, whirling to face him. "I don't want to be saved by you. That is the entire problem. Don't you see? Your noble sacrifice still casts me as the helpless victim who needs a powerful man to rescue her. It validates everything Genevieve said. I would spend the rest of my life working under a cloud of pity, the poor nurse who was saved from the consequences of her own choices. I will not have my agency, my decision, erased by your guilt." She took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. "You made me a promise, Ethan. You promised to relinquish control, but you're still holding on to it. I accepted your apology and your vulnerability. Now you have to accept my strength. We are not running. We are not hiding. And you are not falling on your sword. We are going to fight. This, together. But we are going to do it my way." For the second time in their acquaintance, he was left utterly speechless by the force of her will. She was not the quiet, unassuming nurse anymore. She was a warrior, and she was fighting not just for her reputation, but for the very truth of who she was. "What's your way?" he asked, his voice filled with a new, profound awe. The New England Symposium of Medical Ethics was being held in a grand ballroom at one of Boston's most historic hotels. It was the premier event of its kind, attended by the city's medical elite, and the keynote speaker, the highlight of the three-day event, was Dr. Genevieve Langdon. Her topic, dripping with a cruel and spectacular irony, was navigating asymmetrical power dynamics, protecting the vulnerable in institutional hierarchies. She stood at the podium, poised and confident, her presentation a thinly veiled, sanctimonious retelling of Clara's story, using phrases like implicit coercion and the burden of gratitude. She was brilliant, convincing and utterly reptilian. In the audience, Ethan sat alone, a few rows from the back, his presence causing a ripple of whispers. He was there, as Clara had instructed, not as a combatant, but as a witness. When Genevieve finished her speech to a round of robust applause, she opened the floor to questions, and then, as planned, from the center aisle, Clara Hayes rose and walked to the microphone. She was dressed in a simple but elegant dark blue dress, her hair pulled back, her face composed. She looked not like a victim, but like a professional about to present a case. "Dr. Langdon, thank you for your insightful presentation," Clara began, her voice clear and steady, amplified throughout the cavernous ballroom. A hush fell over the crowd as all eyes turned to her. "You speak eloquently about the risks of coercion when a subordinate provides a profound gift to a superior. But your analysis seems to omit a crucial factor: the subordinate's autonomy." Genevieve's smile tightened. "I believe I addressed the complexities of consent under duress." "I'm not speaking of consent," Clara interrupted calmly. "I'm speaking of choice. The conscious, informed, and uncoerced choice of an individual to act with compassion. You've built your entire keynote around a hypothetical case that is, as many people in this room know, not hypothetical at all. So let me speak not as a hypothetical, but as a fact." She took a breath, her eyes sweeping the room, finally landing on Genevieve at the podium. "My name is Clara Hayes. I'm the head nurse of cardiovascular surgery at Beacon Medical Center, and I was Dr. Ethan Cromwell's bone marrow donor. It was a choice I made freely, as a healthcare professional who took an oath to preserve life. It was a choice I made as a human being who was in a unique position to save another. The narrative of my victimhood is a fiction constructed to serve an agenda of personal ambition. The only unethical act committed in this entire process was the malicious and self-serving violation of two people's medical privacy." From her portfolio, she pulled out a single sheet of paper. "This is my HLA typing report. And this," she said, pulling out another, "is Dr. Cromwell's. A 1 in a million perfect match. This was not coercion. This was fate. And it was my honor to answer its call." She placed the papers on the edge of the stage, turned, and walked away from the microphone. Her dignity, a tangible force that left the entire room in a stunned, protracted silence. The applause, when it finally began, was thunderous. The Ethics Committee hearing was a brief formality. Faced with the public spectacle and the irrefutable evidence, they had no choice but to dismiss all allegations against Clara and Ethan, and to launch a new, far more serious investigation into Dr. Genevieve Langdon. Weeks later, at a hospital-wide town hall meeting, a fully recovered Ethan stood at the podium, ostensibly to announce the launch of a new surgical wing. He spoke for a few minutes before pausing, his gaze sweeping the crowd until he found Clara standing near the back. "This new wing represents the future of this hospital," he said, his voice resonating with a newfound humility. "But our future is nothing without our soul, and the soul of this institution is its people. People who, in the face of darkness, show us the light. I would not be standing here today if it were not for the courage, integrity, and profound compassion of one such person." He looked directly at her, and the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. "Clara Hayes saved my life with an incredible gift. But more than that, she saved me from myself. She reminded a man who thought he had all the answers that the most important questions are about kindness, dignity, and grace. Thank you, Clara, for everything." 6 months later, on a brilliant autumn afternoon, Ethan and Clara walked hand in hand through the Boston Common. Ahead of them, a laughing, vibrant Lily, her hair growing back in soft, dark curls, chased the falling leaves. She was in full remission, the clinical trial a resounding success. Ethan, no longer the head of surgery, had poured his energy and a significant portion of his fortune into their new joint venture. The Hayes Cromwell Donor Advocacy Foundation just received its first major corporate grant this morning, he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride that was a world away from his old arrogance. The board is impressed with our co-chair. Clara smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder. Well, our co-chair has a very persuasive partner. They stopped by the swan boats, watching them glide across the shimmering water, a perfect fairy tale. The silence between them was easy, comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding forged in crisis and tempered by love. He held her hand, his touch gentle, his presence a steady warmth beside her. The arrogant surgeon and the invisible nurse were gone, replaced by two people who had found in each other's deepest vulnerabilities an unshakable, life-affirming strength. They had saved each other, and in doing so, had built a new world, one where value was measured not in status or success, but in the simple, extraordinary beauty of a second chance.